Hello everyone, and welcome to my live Fireside chat on small business and a Green New Deal. I will give y'all a little bit of time to log in so we can get started. Grabbing my iPad, and I'm going to do a share real quick so people know that we're live. So today's topics are going to be about supporting small businesses, diversifying Michigan's economy, progressive taxing, corporate taxes, a living wage, pollution permitting, and the marijuana and the hemp industries. So the first thing that I'm going to get started on is supporting small businesses and talk about what that actually means and what that would look like as a Green New Deal. So give folks some time to get on. I know I'm a couple minutes later than I said I was going to be today. So, okay, I have someone. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound okay for who? I can't tell who's on or whatnot. Just want to make sure that the sound is okay and that you can hear me all right. Yes? No? Maybe so? Oh, and they're good. Okay. So post and post. Okay. So I have it posted in the places that it needs to be posted, and I'll get started and people will just join in. Plus this is recorded and I'll have it up on my YouTube and people can watch it later if you miss part of it too. So I want to get started first on small businesses. And what supporting small businesses is going to look like with a Green New Deal. So when I'm talking about supporting small business, one of the things that I think is very important with small business owners and to help people with startups are small micro grants that will help people be able to do so. So it doesn't take a lot of money to start a small business, but sometimes, depending on the kind of business that you want to be in, a $5,000 hurdle or a $10,000 or a $15,000 hurdle for someone who doesn't have a lot of money or who is currently, impoverished or low income are not going to be able to start their own business. So as a state, we need to be supporting people to be entrepreneurs. We need to be supporting people to be small business owners rather than just workers, because what we saw in the Great Recession is what happened is a lot of people who were workers in big businesses got laid off in order for the big businesses to still be able to give the big tax breaks to their shareholders and to give bonuses to their executives, and the regular people, all of us, were the people who were left without a lot of money and laid off and unemployed. So making sure that there is a good program from the state that removes some of these large tax breaks that we currently are giving right now and instead give them to new entrepreneurs is what is going to help our state. When you look at the Great Recession and who actually benefited or which states didn't have the same issues that we did here in Michigan, the states that had the best recovery or didn't have a lot of problems during the Great Recession are states that had a lot of small businesses, states that relied on local economies rather than big businesses and big box and chain stores. So that's something that we need to work on. So with micro grants, One of the things that we can do is give $5,000, $10,000, or $15,000 grants from the state to people who come to the state with a business plan. And we can certainly talk, in future as this plan kind of gets fleshed out, and of course as we look into this and getting it into legislation, which is what it would have to be, is how would that work? Obviously we don't want to flood the market with restaurants. We don't want to flood the market with liquor stores. We don't want to flood the market with one specific kind of business, because that also harms local economies. We want to make sure that when the state is looking at these businesses and these business plans, that they're for entrepreneurs who are looking for innovative ways of starting new businesses and things that are going to bring in new jobs. So especially that kind of lends into this question about how we can diversify Michigan's economy. So the west side of the state has done a really wonderful job of diversifying their economy. When you look overall at Michigan and our economy and what happened after the Great Recession, the west side of the state is not suffering as much as we are here in the Metro Detroit area, or that we had, because they diversified their economy off of the auto industry. And they have, the beer industry, the microbrew industry, and there's other entrepreneurs in the west side of the state. And so we need to look at making sure that that kind of a business model is happening around our state as well. And so, especially when you look at things like the auto industry is not just the only employer, right? We have the big three, and they employ a lot of people in the Metro Detroit area and around our state, but mainly it's focused in the Metro Detroit area. But then there's all the other little businesses, all the small businesses that help supply the auto industry. And those businesses were the ones that were hurt the most during the Great Recession. So when we look at making sure we have a long-term plan for our economy, we need to make sure that we are supporting those small businesses and that we're diversifying what they can do. So when we look at people who make parts for the auto industry, we need to make sure that they have another industry that they can also supply. So if something happens down the road with the auto industry again, especially when we look at these issues about mass transportation, which is something that we need to do within our state, and when we just look at overall how our country and how the world is moving away from fossil fuels, it is very possible that we are going to start moving away from automobiles in terms of transportation, that we are going to be looking for more green ways of having transportation, including mass transit. And so that is something that is going to harm the auto industry down the road. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm just saying that we as a state, when we look at long-term planning for what our economy is going to look like, we need to make sure that we have an economy that is going to still be moving and still going to be supporting our citizens if something like that happens. And so one of the ways that we can do that is with green jobs. So when we look at green jobs, I'm talking about solar, I'm talking about wind, I'm talking about hydro, and I'm talking about geothermal. So those are 4 different ways of green energy that we can kind of change how our economy works. Especially in the solar, wind, and hydro fields. These are where our tradespeople can go to work. Especially making sure that we have good union jobs, which is going to make sure that we have a living wage going into these jobs. These are the jobs of the future. Green jobs in solar and wind, as the prices continue to fall and as our need for them continues to increase because climate change is real. This is something that we really need to focus on, and that we need to make sure that we're putting our tradespeople to work, but that we're also supporting those businesses as well. Because in Michigan, there's some barriers to entry, and there's some barriers to businesses of even doing things like putting solar panels on their business in order to save their costs. So we do need to change how that works in terms of our legislation and how we regulate our industries. And that's a kind of a longer conversation that we'll have on another Fireside chat as well. But these are things that we need to do because climate change is real, and also because Michigan is going to be a destination because of climate change. By 2100, Michigan is going to be the spot for people to live in because of climate change. And so we also need to make sure that our economy and our local economy by then is solid enough to be able to take in this influx of people. not just in people coming in to live, but making sure that we have jobs for them, that we have industry for them, and that we have this available. And that goes with this idea of entrepreneurship and making sure that we're supporting our citizens who right now cannot afford to start their own business, but may have the skills and the knowledge to be able to do so. And even in that case, we need to make sure that we have not just job training, but also business training. So there's a lot of people out there that want to start a business, but have never run a business before. They've never been a manager before. They don't know how to do the things in terms of financial books. They don't know how to do the things in terms of hiring process, reviewing resumes. How do you do a business plan? We need to make sure that the state is also providing supports for those as well. And that's something that's also going to create jobs. And it's going to make sure that when the state is giving out these micro grants to local people who want to start a business in their local community that is going to positively impact their local community, that they have the knowledge to do so to make that business successful. Because it's kind of a waste of money to give someone $5,000 to start a business when they have a great business plan, but they don't have any of the tools or the supports to make sure that that business succeeds. So we need to make sure that we have all of those supports there for new small business owners and for entrepreneurs to make sure that they're going to succeed when they get this grant money. And we also need to talk about a living wage. So a living wage really gets into the nitty-gritty of this problem with business. So right now in Michigan, it is $48,837 a year is our median living wage. And our median income is $52,492. But 40% of households in Michigan currently are in what we would call the working poor. So the working poor are people who sometimes have to decide which bill that they're going to pay, or the parents eat twice a day so the kids can eat 3 times a day or sometimes less. And this is also seen in our statistics with public education. So we need to make sure that we have a $15 an hour minimum wage, but not just a $15 an hour minimum wage. We need to tie this minimum wage to things like housing. We need to tie this to the other issues of insurance, of food costs, and we need to make sure that when we create a new bill that is going to raise our minimum wage, that it's not just going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and that's going to solve all of our problems, because that's not the case. We need to make sure that we have additional protections when it comes to inflation, and not just your natural inflation of the economy, but inflation in terms of cost of living. And all of those things like childcare, housing, food, healthcare, transportation, etc. So when we talk about making this legislation for $15 an hour, that's not where we stop. That's where we're starting. And that's really important to do so. So does anyone have any questions for me before I move on to the next part? Okay. All right, so I want to talk about corporate taxing. So currently right now, Michigan is at a negative 73% when it comes to our business tax. And so what that means is that our business tax is the largest, I don't know, they suck up the most money from our state budget, is in corporate tax returns. And so we're currently at a -5 tax right now. And we have a lot of businesses that currently have a lot of unstable and temporary workers. And so one of the things that we need to change within our corporate tax code is we need to penalize businesses that use temporary workers and have an unstable workforce. So especially in the larger businesses. So I just had a long conversation with someone in Detroit who was telling me about their family members who work for Ford, and they're drivers for Ford that help drive people around their complexes, and they're all temp workers. And so those temp workers do not get any benefits. Those temp workers are not put into a pension fund. Those temp workers do not get any of the benefits that a full-time worker does. Yet Ford uses these temp workers on a consistent, regular basis. So they should be real employees of Ford, yet they're not, and they're temp workers. And so they also, their jobs are unstable. So that creates them, and their family life and their home life is also more unstable when they don't know exactly how their job is going to stay. Can they actually get a real job? I have heard other stories and issues of secretaries being temps for 40 years. So you don't actually get to even retire from the company that you spent that many years at. This is a big problem, and it's something that corporations have been getting away with for far too long. And we need to also make sure that we're giving incentives to businesses when we talk about the right incentives. So I'm not saying that we should always just penalize and tax corporations, which we should tax them and we should give penalties when need be, but we need to also give tax breaks where they should be going to. And that means giving tax breaks to businesses that actually use recycled goods, so that we're not just recycling. And that what happens oftentimes with recycling is that recycled products are actually not used. So you have recycling, we do our curbside recycling, and it goes to the recycling plant, they recycle things, and then what happens to that recycled product? Sometimes it's not used, and if it's not used, then it goes back into our trash. And so we need to give incentives to businesses to use recycled products. Recycled paper, recycled plastic, any kind of recycled goods, businesses should be getting a tax break for using. That will make sure that we're actually using recycled goods. And we also need to make sure that we're giving breaks for using green energy and for building new green buildings. So when we have businesses that are doing a new build, building a new building, it should be LEED certified. And if a building is LEED certified with a corporation, we need to make sure that that corporation does get a benefit for doing so, because we do need to incentivize green energy, and we need to incentivize green business. So when we talk about this issue of tax incentives and subsidies and corporate welfare and tax credits, currently in Michigan, in 2015, there was $9.4 billion given to corporations for tax credits and tax incentives. But in Michigan, we have a problem where these tax credits are not transparent. And so any kind of search that you do, when you look into any articles and instructions in business, you're not going to find who's getting what and how much they're getting and what they're getting it for. And that would take, FOIAs of these corporate tax returns from our state. So that's a huge problem. We need to make sure that this corporate taxes, that should be FOIA-able, and that should also be more transparent. We need to make sure that we as the citizenry understand where these tax credits are going, because that's our tax dollars. It's our property tax dollars, it's our sales tax dollars that are going back to these businesses. And we need to make sure that these credits and these incentives that are being given to businesses are actually beneficial. So when you looked at the Amazon deal, that Amazon was coming to Detroit, or Detroit did a pitch for Amazon to come to Detroit, one of the incentives was that Amazon was not going to have to pay sales tax, or not sales tax, the city tax in Detroit. And that would have been a huge loss of revenue for Detroit, but there were no requirements that Detroit would then have to or that Amazon would then have to hire a certain amount of Detroiters or make sure that that tax revenue came in a different way, and that's not the case. And so that's kind of protections that we need to make sure when we look at how these big corporations are getting these tax breaks. So Daryl is asking, do you see recycling as a green business? So yes, absolutely. Recycling is certainly a green business. There are certain aspects of recycling that can be considered not green, especially when you look at the waste from recycling. And sometimes there's a water usage with recycling as well. But recycling is certainly a green business, and that's something that we need to encourage more of, especially when you look at this problem of apartment buildings generally don't recycle. Sometimes in condo associations, they don't recycle, and we need to expand that as well. But having more recycling is not going to do much for us until we actually change the incentive that businesses start using more recycled products. So this other issue of corporations and corporate welfare also comes to unemployment. And so we recently had this problem of unemployment fraud, and we had this huge deal. Our state is now going to be on the hook for having problems with the unemployment system. But the way our unemployment system is set up is our unemployment system is set up to help a business not pay unemployment to a former employee. And the benefit of the doubt is on the business, not on the person unemployed. And that's certainly not what unemployment was set up for in the first place. And so we need to make sure that when we have unemployment, that we change how unemployment is handled in Michigan, and that unemployment is a benefit to the former employee more than the corporation. That the burden of proof on whether or not that employee was terminated on whatever reason for the denial is actually on the corporation, not on the employee. So Benny asked, one example of temporary employment agencies can be seen in nursing. What has been happening is healthcare corporations are getting, it's kind of long, are getting rid of their permanent employees and replacing them with staff from agencies. Yes. I can't read the rest of your comment because it's on my phone and it's just not, it's not allowing me to read that. But yes, absolutely. So temporary employment is not just obviously in the auto industry. That was just an example. And yes, this issue of temporary employees allows companies to not have to pay people benefits, allows companies to not have to pay people, put money into a 401k or a pension fund or really anything. They don't have to pay them anything. And so that's a huge issue because that puts more of a financial burden on someone who, especially in the case of a temporary worker, temp workers generally make less money than a permanent employee does, especially because permanent employees then have the ability to potentially get raises and advancement in their careers, and temp employees do not get that benefit. And that is a huge problem. So we need to place a large penalty on these corporations that are using this current loophole and cut that loophole out and force companies to actually pay their employees. So I want to talk a little bit. So Michigan right now, when it comes to taxing, just has a flat tax. And when you look at corporate taxing as well as just regular income tax, a flat tax is inherently more beneficial to the rich and less beneficial to the poor. And so we call that a regressive tax. That's actually a sales tax, and things like that are also technically regressive taxes as well. But currently, corporate taxes in Michigan is a flat tax of 6% for C corporations. And we need to make sure that we have a progressive tax, not just in our personal income tax, but we need a progressive tax in our corporate income tax as well. Because this tax burden that the state currently has, that all of this money is owed to corporations and corporate tax breaks, is coming on the backs of you and I. And so we are paying for those corporate tax cuts, and those corporations, especially when you look at our state and the state of our state right now, they are not giving it back to us as employees, and they are not giving it back to the state and any other kind of benefit. So basically the state is just giving big corporations our money for free. But we know that because we've seen that with Nestle, right? And so when we look at these problems, this is because we currently live in an oligarchy. It's because people who have the most money, the top 1% of the top 1%, are the people that own our politicians. They are the people that put the dark money into our state elections, and they are the people that not just own our politicians, but they're the ones that own the businesses that are then getting the tax breaks. And those CEOs are then also getting the money. And so it works in this cycle. When we talk about trickle-down economics, is not actually a trickle-down, it is a waterfall up. Because if there is a huge ton of water and only a little bit is trickling down, it's staying at the top or it's waterfalling up, which is really the case. Because we are paying our taxes. We have a higher tax rate for people who actually make less money on a federal level, and some of that federal money goes back to the state as well. And so when we are doing that, we need to make sure that we are actually having a progressive tax, not just for our personal income tax, but also in corporations, so that the larger corporations are paying the larger share, because we don't want to put that tax burden on our small businesses, because our small businesses are really the ones that drive our economy, and they're the businesses that have a lesser income than a place like Walmart. How will your policies and ideas keep corporate Michigan from retaliation, layoffs, reduced hours, etc.? So there certainly will be retaliation from corporate America. We saw that with the Great Recession. That's what happened. But the way that we fix that is we make sure that we are helping support small business owners, and that we're supporting entrepreneurs to be able to start their own business. So if someone gets laid off from a corporate job, that person should automatically be eligible for a $5,000 grant from the state to be able to start their own business. And not just, of course, those people, but also making sure that we have job training for people who want to switch careers. So oftentimes what happened during the Great Recession with people who worked in the auto industry for 10, 15 years and then got laid off, they may have wanted to go into another kind of a job, but they weren't able to because they didn't have the job training. And so we need to make sure that we have college accessible. So this kind of gets into this question of free college, and making sure that people can actually go back to school and learn a new either trade or learn a new skill, or be able to change careers as well. So when we talk about this corporate retaliation, that is what happens. And that's a really good question, Daryl. But we need to make sure that we know that that's going to happen, right? And so we know that Walmart is going to say, oh, okay, you're going to raise our taxes, we're going to lay off workers. So then what are we going to do? We're going to make sure that those Walmart workers who were laid off are able to get into a new job, are able to get unemployment on the burden of Walmart saying no, rather than them having to go through all of the hoops in order to get their unemployment, and making sure that they can go back to school if they want to go back to school, and giving them the skills to be able to start their own business if they want to start their own business. Because when we look at this box store problem, especially the retail problem, so we have a huge retail crisis that is just hitting our country right now, and this retail crisis is going to continue to have ramifications going forward. We have all the Toys R Us closings, we have Claire's closings. A lot of these stores are closing because of hedge funds who did these predatory lendings to these retail stores, who were able to refinance their loans to keep them going until now rates are going up. And so because rates are going up, these stores can't refinance, and that's why you're seeing part of this problem with places like Toys R Us going out of business. It's not just the issue of Amazon, it's actually an issue of predatory lending from corporate hedge funds. So we need to make sure that, let's say someone wants to, is laid off from Toys R Us because Toys R Us is going out of business, but they want to be able to start their own toy store, maybe not necessarily in that same space because they wouldn't be able to do such a large space, but making sure that we have incentives to be able to have business property owners that own these big box stores. One of the problems that we've seen with them being able to fill these spaces is that these spaces are so huge. So you have a huge empty old Kmart building. And what are you going to do with this huge empty old Kmart building if you don't have another large store coming in and being able to use all of that space? We need to give some incentives as well to the property owners that own these business properties to take these large spaces and be able to break them into smaller spaces so we can support more smaller businesses. And that's certainly something that we can do, and that's a way that we can kind of change how we do our tax breaks, and we can change our taxing. So when we talk about progressive taxing, we obviously have this problem with the Trump tax cut. And that is going to have ramifications in our state going forward. We had, in 1993, we had a 3% taxing, and our percentage average was better than when we had that 3% taxing in 2004. it dropped down. So what is happening right now is we have, right now a 4.25% personal tax. And that 4.25% personal tax, I just kind of wanted to break down a couple of numbers for you. So we have, for someone who is making $1 million a year, that's $42,500, which gives them then $957,500, just saying, of course, that they don't have any other tax breaks and things like that. Someone who makes $100,000 a year, that's $4,250, which gives them an income of $95,750. But the major problem is when you get to someone who makes $15,000 a year, and that's $637.50. So that makes their income $14,362.50. And so anyone who makes, truly in Michigan, under where our median is, so under that $42,000 set, should not have to pay the personal income tax. So we need to take this median average, and we need to make sure that that median, that anyone who is below that does not pay a state tax. Because for those people, for someone who makes $15,000 a year, to take $637 from them is a huge amount of money that is probably their rent for a month that year. And that's not fiscally responsible as a state to be penalizing people who are poor, because people who are poor are already penalized with higher food costs, higher transportation costs, higher insurance costs, higher housing costs, etc. And so we need to make sure that when we're looking at this issue, an idea of a progressive tax, that the progressive tax burden is on the wealthy and it's not on the poor. So any questions on taxing before I move into my last two sections? Okay. So I want to talk about pollution permits. And I wanted to separate that from corporate taxes because not all corporations are polluters. And so this is something that we really need to have a larger, not just a fee, but we need to have a larger kind of conversation about what these pollution permits are and what they do and what they're for. So right now, a corporation who is doing air pollution or water pollution has to get a permit from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. If they are doing an expansion or something of the sort, there's an additional permitting process they have to go through. But I just got an email just a couple of days ago that the Michigan DEQ just approved a new permit for the Dearborn plant for DTE. And so we're now going to have more air pollution coming out of Dearborn because of this permit. And I don't know how much this permit costs. I've been doing some research to try to find out how much money that they're actually being charged. But what I've heard from people who work at the MDEQ and what I've seen in some of my research is that this permitting process, and to kind of step back for a second, so when I worked for Clean Water Action over 15 years ago, I actually worked on a campaign to start charging fees for these pollution permits. Because before that, companies could just apply for a permit, get a permit, and start polluting. So there was no money for the actual monitoring of these pollution permits, except what was given to the department by the state. So right now, what we're seeing is, I'm sure that that hasn't changed, and that fee was pretty minimal about 15 years ago. And it was supposed to pay for one visit per year to these facilities. And that's certainly not enough to make sure that these companies and facilities are in compliance. What was happening before is they were being visited once every 3 years. And if the permitting system hasn't changed in over 15 years, then I'm sure that permit fee is now no longer enough to cover even a once-a-year visit. And so we need to make sure that we are charging companies the true cost of doing business. So when someone is polluting into our water, they need to pay for the cleanup and for the health effects of doing that pollution. And that is where the large dollar amount is going to come from these companies. It needs to include also the monitoring. And so we need to make sure that that also is an escalating scale. We need to be charging air polluters large dollar amounts, because especially when you look at what's happening with DTE, you and I as ratepayers are going to be paying for that expansion as well. So not only are they getting a permit and they're expanding and they're making money, they're then not just giving us the cost for that expansion as ratepayers, they are giving us that cost as taxpayers when it comes to health issues that come from additional air pollution, cleanup issues when it comes to, 93% of our lakes and rivers are polluted with mercury, which is from air pollution. And we need to hold these businesses accountable. And the best way to hold these businesses accountable is through their pocketbook. So Betty is asking, also a potash mine in Muskegon, in which a senator told the MDEQ to ignore the environmental protesters. Yes. And that's why we need Greens in the legislature. So we only need 12 people in the state house and 10 people in the state senate in order to have a super minority of the Green Party in our state legislature, and we can really change things around. We can break the majority from either of these two parties that are in the pocketbooks of these major polluters, depending on which polluter they are. Some of them lean Republican, some of them lean Democrat, but polluters love both of these major parties, and we need to change things around in our legislature, as well as in our executive branch too. So does anyone have any questions on pollution permits before I move into my last point on the marijuana and hemp industries? Okay. So the marijuana and hemp industries are going to be beneficial to us in a multitude of ways. So number one, it is going to bring in new jobs and is going to bring in new tax revenue. Right now in Colorado and California and other states that have legalized marijuana, they are getting tens of billions of dollars of new tax revenue and new jobs every day. It is a wonderful industry, not just for people that enjoy smoking. It has really amazing potentials in agriculture and in other industries. So Michigan, obviously, we have a very large agricultural portion of our state. And in the agricultural areas of our state, hemp is actually a crop that can be used for rotation. Hemp is a really good crop for soil. It helps when farmers are actually moving different crops around, because every crop kind of takes different kind of minerals from the soil, and so farmers have to do what's called crop rotation and move in sections of their farm where they are actually growing these different crops. And hemp, not just marijuana the plant, but hemp, which is the non-THC plant, is a really good plant that you can plant after you've had, like, let's say tomatoes, and those tomatoes have sucked up certain kinds of minerals from the soil. If you plant then hemp there, hemp is actually a plant that is going to renew the soil, so you can then put back either tomatoes or another plant. So it's a really good plant to use in crop rotation. So it's beneficial to our farmers just in that aspect. Hemp is also good for clothing. It can be used in concrete. Hemp can be used in beauty care products and many other products. So we can use hemp oil. We can have many industries that are going to kind of pop up from allowing hemp to be an industry in Michigan again. And then when we talk about just the medicinal aspect of not just marijuana, but also this boon of CBD oil. So if we in Michigan can really take advantage of the new marijuana and hemp industry, and we can make sure that we're also giving, positive benefits to people in this new industry in terms of tax breaks, but we're also making sure that we are supporting these businesses and supporting things like CBD oil, then we are really going to have not just a lot of new money coming into the state and a lot of new jobs coming into the state, but we can use that money responsibly. And that's the biggest thing. We need to make sure that this money that's coming in from this new revenue source of the marijuana industry is not just going back to big corporate tax breaks. It's not just going back to big corporations and CEOs that currently own our politicians. We need to make sure that that money is used responsibly to fix our problems with public education, is used responsibly to fix our roads, our water infrastructure, and to make sure that we as Michiganders can actually benefit from this new industry instead of just the top 1% benefiting from this new industry. So those are the few things that I just wanted to make sure that I touch on small business and what a Green New Deal would look like in Michigan. So I've been going for about 2 hours now. Does anyone have any other questions for me? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for watching and listening. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions later. Feel free to share this video to people. And I hope you all have a good evening.